right, it's good to see everybody this evening. If you would, just go ahead and open your books to Matthew 24. Matthew 24. We're going to get back to the study that it's probably been several weeks since we discussed it, because we got some questions that had come in over the last couple of weeks. That obviously anytime somebody takes the time to contact us and ask a question, whatever it is that we're doing, we're going to stop and we're going to answer whatever question comes our way. And of course, last week we had the matter of cremation and hellfire and hell in the Old Testament. And I realized when I looked at the bulletin this morning that I had forgotten to give all the statistics for our views, but I did make mention that last Sunday night's study on cremation and hellfire had over 1,000 views in the first 24 hours. I was looking at it on Monday evening, and we had topped 1,000 views, and so we're just so blessed to have folks watching. And of course, when people ask questions, it's generally indicative that other people have those same questions, and so I was happy to have those particular questions. And we're going to get back this week to the matter of the tribulation, and what I titled this as revisiting Darby's delusion. For some reason my camera's not straight. It's not much straighter, but that's a little bit better. It wasn't very good this morning either. But we're going to look at revisiting Darby's delusion with the matter of the tribulation. And we call it Darby's delusion because the theories that pertain to premillennialism did not arise until the early 1800s in England, from a preacher by the name of John Darby. And Darby was, I forgot what they referred to them as the Plymouth Brethren. There was some reference to the group that he was associated with. And he published a Bible in the late 1800s. It's called Darby's Bible. It's his own translation, but it has all of his premillennial notes in it. And the American, I won't say the American version, but the Bible that really introduced and propagated premillennial doctrine in America was the Scofield Bible, which I believe is 1909. But that's the reason the topic is listed as it streams on Facebook and on YouTube as Darby's Delusion. There was a man, and I don't know if I'm saying his name properly or not, but his name was Samuel Tregelles, Tregelles. And he was a Bible scholar who was contemporary to Darby. And they were of the same religious mindset. Again, I think it was called the Plymouth Brethren. They were not a part of the Anglican Church, and as such, they were considered outcasts among the English people. In fact, you could only attend Oxford. See, there's Oxford, and there's another university in addition to Oxford, that's prestigious. And during that particular time, you could only attend those universities if you were an Anglican. And because these men were not Anglicans, they were denied access to the top level universities in England. But Tregelles turned out to be one of the greatest textual critics of his day, and his work continues even today to be among the most highly regarded until a fellow by the name of Tischendorf published a compilation of the biblical text. But Tregelles referred to Darby's doctrine on premillennialism as the height of speculative nonsense. And I thought those those are pretty strong words. They are the height of speculative nonsense, and yet this is a doctrine that is held. Well, not so much in England, because that's about the most irreligious bunch that there is anymore. But in America, the doctrines pertaining to premillennialism are widely held by many evangelicals, Methodists, Baptists, community church type, and has the doctrine has a lot of sway, or it did for a long time. It had a lot of sway in the American political system. And by the way, there are a lot of people who don't hold necessarily all the premillennial doctrines, but they still hold to some idea that God has some future restoration of the nation of Israel. That there are some people that, even though they don't embrace all the premillennial doctrines, there's about 7 major ideas that make up that whole. But there's still a lot of people who believe, without embracing all the premill, that think that somehow God still has some unfinished business with the nation of Israel. And that mindset has dominated, or it did dominate, the American political system for many years through the 1950s and afterward. And much of American foreign policy has been based in premillennial or future Israel restoration theory. And so America, by and large, has been an ally of Israel, because for many years America was basically a Christian nation. And you know what I mean when I use that terminology. It was basically a Christian nation, and as such thought that as the United States, that they needed to do all they could to help Israel, because in the back of their mind, if you don't help Israel, you're not helping God's people. Now, personally, I'm glad that Israel is our ally, but not because I believe that God has any more dealings with the nation of Israel. Some of the things that we'll study tonight, I think, show conclusively that God has no more dealings with the physical nation of Israel, the one that was established in 1948. And there are a number of reasons for that, but I won't go into all of them. But for example, my political leanings towards Israel as an ally don't have anything to do with my view of the Bible. Okay, they have to do with my view of democracy, my view of Islam, and how low regard I hold the Islamic faith and nations that embrace the Islamic faith. And so though my views may somewhat mirror them, but they're from a completely different frame of mind. And so, but the last thing that we talked about in this series was the matter of the rapture. And we examined some of the statements by one of the foremost premillennial apologists, a man by the name of John Hagee. And I believe Hagee is I think he's out of Houston, Texas, but he's somewhere in Texas. And he has a huge television following. He has a huge social media following. And he is one of the foremost, he's one of the foremost apologists and preachers of premillennial doctrine. And we were talking about some of the things that he said that was posted, seemed like it was all the way back in July, Kyle, now that I'm thinking about it, that he had posted a sermon on Facebook. And in just a matter of a few days, it had 200,000 or 300,000 views. And so we examined some of his statements that pertain to the matter of the rapture. Now, in the thought process of the premillennialist, the rapture is something that is supposed to precede a period of time known as the tribulation. And according to premillennial theory, that right before the tribulation takes place, that there's going to be that secret snatching away of people all over the world. They're just going to vanish into thin air. Like I said, cars are going to be flying down the highway, and then all of a sudden the drivers are going to be gone. Airplanes are going to be in the air and the pilots are going to be gone. I mean, it's just going to be mass pandemonium, because people are just going to literally disappear by the millions all around the world. And then after that period of time, there's going to be a period of time in that time frame where the so-called Antichrist is going to rise up, and he's going to begin to persecute the church. He's going to enter into a period of world domination, and at the end of that 7-year period, Jesus is going to come back with all of the people that disappeared, and there's going to be a giant war that we know as Armageddon. That's why it's been labeled as Armageddon. And that Jesus is going to fight a literal war with his servants against the servants of the Antichrist. And of course, Jesus is going to win. And at that time, he's going to set up a physical kingdom in Israel and reign for 1,000 years, at which time, at the conclusion of that time, the judgment of all humanity will take place. Now, if you recall, we also talked about Armageddon to some degree. And you remember we talked about the passages out of the book of Revelation. How, it's got to be China. It's got to be China. It's got to be China. Well, why does it have to be China? Well, because in the book of Revelation it says there's going to be an army of 200 million horsemen. And the only nation on earth that can provide 200 million horsemen is China. And then we started, if you recall, we started doing the math. And we started looking at the valley of Megiddo, where this great battle is going to take place. And you can't fit 200 million people in that place, much less 200 million people riding horses. And you also have the problem, if you recall, that there's only 16 million horses in the whole world. And so somebody needs to get busy in the horse raising business, if we're going to supply the horses for 200 million Chinese military folks. And so that's kind of a summation of the entire doctrine. But this idea of tribulation has begun to start bubbling up, because anytime you hear people talking about the rapture, those things are inseparable from the tribulation, because one leads immediately into the other. And so you can't talk about the rapture without invoking the idea that there's going to be a world tribulation. And the text that is the go-to text for this idea of the tribulation is Matthew 24. So I've had you open your Bibles there, but let me just make a note in your minds that the word tribulation appears 21 times in the Greek New Testament. Okay? That word. It's found 21 times in the Greek, the original language of the New Testament. And sometimes it just means persecution. For example, in this world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer, I have overcome the world. John 16 and verse 33. Or in this world you will have trouble. John 16, 21. You can have anguish. It can be affliction. And so, the word has, as always, context demands meaning. But it also is used, the word tribulation is also used to refer to a specific tribulation. In other words, there's general tribulation that all Christians endure for the cause of Christ. But there is in the New Testament, the idea of the tribulation. In other words, there is a specific time and event known as the tribulation. Okay? And the reason I mention that is, the Bible never teaches that there is an Antichrist. You always hear about the Antichrist, the Antichrist, the Antichrist. And you never ever read in the Bible about the Antichrist. In fact, if you read in your New Testament, you read the book of Revelation, you'll never find the word Antichrist in the book of Revelation. But it is found in John's epistles, in 1 John and 2 John. But John says, you have heard that the Antichrist is, that an Antichrist is coming. He said, even now there are many Antichrists who have already come, whereby we know it is the last time. Now, when John wrote his book about 2,000 years ago, he said there's not just one, there's a whole slew of them. And by this we know that we are living in the last time. And so there is no Antichrist. Okay? There is no singular figure, past, present, or future, known as the Antichrist, but there is a tribulation, a specific tribulation that the Bible discusses. All right, so in Matthew 24, here, in verse 21, now I'm just going to take you straight to the text that makes mention of the word, and then we'll put it in its proper time frame. It says, everybody looking at this, right? Verse 21. Give me that word, hon. Then. All right? Now, we got to remember that word, then. Then means at this particular time, then, right? We understand what then is. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever will be. And then it goes on to talk about some things that are associated with it. But the key I want us to understand is then. Then. All right, so now, when we see then, we got to determine what? When. Right? We got to find when is the then. All right, well, let's go back in our Bibles up to verse number 14. Verse 14. And by the way, just for the time being, we're skipping over all the general signs of famines and pestilences and earthquakes and wars and rumors of wars that are in the earlier part of the chapter. In verse 14 it says, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all nations, and then the end will come. There's that word then. In other words, when the gospel is preached to everybody, then the end will come. Well, what is the end of which he speaks? Well, here it comes, verse 15. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house. Let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. Woe to those who are pregnant, to those who are nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. And so the Lord is clear that this tribulation is going to take place when two events occur. The first event is the preaching of the gospel to the whole world. Remember verse 14. When the gospel of the kingdom is preached to the whole world, then the end will come. Second event, verse 15. When you see the abomination of desolation at Jerusalem that Daniel talked about. So now we have us a marker. Okay? We have us a marker, because then from then on we read all the way down to verse 21, and Jesus identifies this specific time frame as the Great Tribulation. There will be great tribulation. So now we have our time And let me just, for those that are watching, or if anybody, we're going to start. Verse 14 is gospel preached to the whole world. And then verse 15, and I can spell abomination and desolation, but I'm not going to, just for the sake of time, okay? I'm not like that policeman that pulled somebody over in Andalusia and couldn't spell it, so he said, drive on down to Op so I can write you a ticket. Right? The abomination of desolation. So there's our time frame marker. Now we need to figure out, because I'm going to come back to verse 14 in a minute. We need to find out, what is this? He said, you're going to see it. When you see it, when you see what Daniel talked about. Now, take your Bibles and turn to the book of Luke. And go to chapter 21. Now remember, what happens when the people see this? What are they supposed to do? Give it to me in one word. Flee or run. Either one of them will work. That's right. When you see this, you flee, you run. Now, the reason I mention that is I want you to understand that what we're about to read in Luke 21 corresponds to Matthew's text. We're not talking about two different things. We're talking about the same thing in two different gospel accounts. Look at verse 20 of Luke chapter 21. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, what does it say? You'll know that its desolation is near. In other words, you're going to see a thing. You're going to see the city of Jerusalem being surrounded by its enemies. Now look at verse 21. When you see that, what are you supposed to do? Flee or run. Right? So the reason I mention that is that what you're supposed to do when you see this is exactly the same thing when you see this. So what we know is that the abomination of desolation in Matthew 24 is the exact same thing as Jerusalem surrounded by her enemies. All right? And when this happens, it's the equivalent of this, and you're supposed to run. Why? Because the destruction of Jerusalem is near. The destruction of Jerusalem is near. And so we have now our time frame. And we also have the explanation of the time frame. Now I said I was going to come back to this, and now I'm going to do that. Do we know with any degree of certainty that the gospel was preached to the whole world in this time frame? In this time frame. Open your Bibles, if you would, to Colossians chapter 1 and verse 6. Colossians 1 and verse 6. Johnny, you there?
Yep.
Read it for me, please.
Which is come unto you, as it is in all the world, and bringeth forth fruit, as it does also in you, since the day you heard of it, and knew the grace of God in truth.
All right, now, I got to go back to verse 5, because in verse 6 it talks about whatever it is that came into the whole world, but it didn't identify. But it's in verse 5. Give me verse 5.
For the hope which is laid up for you in heaven, whereof you heard before in the word of the truth of the gospel.
You heard it in the word of the truth of the gospel, which what? Has come to you, as it also has what?
All the world.
All the world. So Paul told the Colossian brethren they had heard the gospel, and everybody else in the world had heard the gospel, right? Go down to verse 23. I'm thinking there's another similar reference in verse 23 there at Colossians 1.
Continue in the faith grounded and settled. Be not moved away from the hope of the gospel which you have heard, which is preached to every creature which is under heaven, whereof I, Paul, am made a minister.
The gospel which was preached to what?
All.
I love the language there. Every creature under heaven. So 2 times in Colossians 1, Paul says the gospel's been preached to everybody. And by the way, just for the sake of time, you'll see him make that exact same statement in Romans chapter 10 and verse 16. Let me just write these 2 references down. Colossians 1, 6 and 23, and Romans 10 and verse 16. So now we have our time frame even further solidified, don't we? The tribulation's going to come then. When? When the gospel's preached to the whole world, and when Jerusalem is surrounded by her armies. So what does that tell us necessarily about the tribulation of Matthew 24:21? Give me any fact that we can know with absolute certainty about the tribulation of Matthew 24:21, based on what we've just learned right here. What can we know? Number one, it's already happened. It's already and that's the most important thing we need to know. It's already happened. And if it's already happened, it's not yet in the future, is it? Right. We don't have anything to be afraid of with regard to a great tribulation, because we know with 100% certainty, absolute clarity, the tribulation of Matthew 24:21 has already taken place, because the 2 markers that Jesus gave for it have already been brought to fruition. All right? Now let's move a little further down into the text, because there is an objection that we'll hear if we're discussing this with anybody that understands. You understand? When you talk to people who know their doctrine, all right? Now let me explain to you what I mean by that. I know a lot of people that believe in the rapture and the tribulation, but they couldn't find you one verse in the Bible that their people use to support it. All right? But I do have some friends who are basically good Bible students. And what I mean by that is they at least can go to the Bible and try to tell you why they believe this. And so if you're talking to someone that can at least go to his own doctrine, of course, obviously you're going to show them this and you're going to see that it's not right. But they might move further into the text and they say, well, let's go down to verse 29. So how do you think, how do you figure this based on beginning in this is back in Matthew 24, by the way, back in Matthew 24. And again, it's one of those situations where we've got to let the Bible say what it clearly says. People say, well, the tribulation we're talking about has to be a worldwide, it can't be already happened because of the language that's used, and the only thing that answers to it is the coming of Jesus. All right, look at verse 29, 30, and 31. It says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened. And by the way, here's where they start. They're going to skip what the first line says, and they're going to go right into the signs. The sun shall be darkened. The moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken, and the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on clouds of heaven with power and great glory, and he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. All right. There's two things that people are going to try to make this text teach. Number one, that the destruction of Jerusalem can't fit the description of verses 29 to 31. The second thing they're going to try to make it teach is the rapture. That he's going to gather his elect, right? He's going to gather his elect. Now, let's go back to the opening line of Matthew 24:29. All right? And there's going to be some key words. Especially, again, it's interesting to me that in these studies, the words that people miss are the ones that are most important. And they miss them because they're not great big words. You know what I mean? You know, they're not apocalyptic type words. You know, they want to focus on the sun and the moon and the stars and the clouds, and they miss the simple statements that are in there. Give me the first two words of verse 29. Immediately. Immediately after. Immediately after what? The tribulation of those days. You see how that works? Immediately after the tribulation of those days. The days that we've just been talking about, where the gospel's preached to the whole world, and Jerusalem is surrounded by its armies. When the Roman armies prepare to come in, that's this. That's this. Immediately after all that, then the destruction comes. See, all the things that we've talked about up until verse 29 is leading up to the actual destruction of Jerusalem itself, which there were hard times leading up to that, right? I mean, there was famine. They besieged Jerusalem. People were starving. You know, there was no food to eat. It was just incredible. It was just incredible suffering. But the city wasn't destroyed yet. There's still the destruction of the city that has to take place. And that's what verse 29 is going to tell us about. Immediately after all of this comes to fruition, then the city's fixing to get wiped completely out. It's going to get wiped completely out. Now, I want you to think about some things very quickly. Number one, immediately after the tribulation of those days, he says it's going to get bad. It's going to look like the world's coming to an end. Is basically what Jesus is saying. All right. So number one. And by the way, then we get to the end. And what did we say is they believe that verse 31 teaches? Verse 31 teaches the what? The rapture. He's going to gather them up. Verse 31. The rapture is going to gather them up. Now, in every single premillennial theory I've ever heard or read, what comes first, the rapture or the tribulation? The rapture. And then the tribulation. But if verse 31 is going to be used to teach the rapture, then what has to come first? The tribulation has to come first. Because verse 31 comes after verse 29, and verse 29 begins with immediately after. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, this is going to happen. And so, again, let the text, these are real simple words. Immediately after those days. The simple text point us to the time and the place. And then where this is posted at the end of this text, it won't work for the rapture in all these other instances. All right, now, any questions on this before I get into 29 to 31? All right, now, with regard to the language of verses 29 to 31, and they say, well, this language can't just be the destruction of Jerusalem. It has to be the end of the whole world. Because, the moon, the sun, the stars, this massive apocalypse is taking place. All right? Open your Bibles to the book of Isaiah, chapter 13. Isaiah 13. Right now, do any of you have a heading? And by the way, it's a man-made heading. Does anybody have a man-made heading at the beginning of chapter 13? The doom of Babylon. Somebody have something? The judgment of Babylon. The burden, by the way, the word burden in the King James means a pronouncement of doom. Because, for example, the book of Nahum begins, the burden of Nineveh. What?
Mine says the desolation.
The desolation. So we have a doom, a destruction, a burden.
Mine says the prophecies against Babylon.
Prophecies against Babylon. And so what we're talking about here is something really, really bad, right? Again, when you see that word burden, like in Nahum, the burden of Nineveh, God is fixing to waylay Nineveh. All right? Now, go down to verse 10 and look at the language that the prophet uses in his assessment of what God is fixing to do to Babylon. Let's begin in verse 9. Behold, the day of the Lord comes. That's a judgment. That's a judgment statement. The day of the Lord's coming. Cruel, with both wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate. He will destroy its sinners from it. For the stars of heaven and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be darkened in its going forth, and the moon will not cause its light to shine. And I will punish the world for its evil and the wicked for their iniquity. I'll halt the arrogance of the proud and lay low the haughtiness of the terrible. Verse 13, I will shake the heavens, and the earth will move out of her place in the wrath of the Lord of hosts in the day of his fierce anger. That's some pretty rough language, isn't it? And doesn't it sound a lot like Matthew 24? Sun, stars, moon, shaken, no light. And yet this is a statement that Isaiah made against Babylon. And by the way, what happened to Babylon? What happened to it? Got wiped out. And by the way, did it ever rise again? Never did. All right, now let's go down in the text of Isaiah to chapter 34.
Well, there's one thing I didn't understand. They said the sun won't shine. If the sun don't shine, the moon's not going to shine.
Well, that's true. If the sun don't shine, the moon don't shine. Isaiah 34. Now, I have a heading, Judgment on the Nations. Judgment on the nations. The nations is a reference to Gentile peoples. because the word nation and the word Gentile come from the same word. In other words, it means people that are not Jews, not God's people. Boy, does anybody else have another heading there at the top of 34? Woe to the nations. Indignation.
Of the Lord.
Indignation of the Lord. Fury of the Lord. Now, what kind of language do we find here? Well, verse 1. Come near, you nations, and hear, and heed, you people. Let the earth hear and all that is in it, the world and all the things that come forth from it. For the indignation of the Lord is against all nations, and his fury against all their armies. He has utterly destroyed them, given them over to slaughter. Their slain shall be thrown out. The stench shall rise from their corpses, and the mountains shall be melted with their blood. Look at verse 4. All the host of heaven will be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled up like a scroll. Their host shall fall down as the leaf falls from the vine, and as fruit falling from a fig tree. For my sword shall be bathed in heaven. Indeed, it shall come down on Edom and on the people of my curse. Again, look at the apocalyptic language. And this is just against the Edomites. This is not some world-dominating power. This is the Edomites. But again, note the language. How he's talking about all the stars. The sky will be rolled up like a scroll. And all he's talking about, and I say that accommodatively, all he's talking about here is Edom. Now, for the sake of time, we won't go in and read it. But if you read Ezekiel 32, verses 7 and 8, you'll find similar words against the nation of Egypt. And in Matthew 24, you find the words against the city of Jerusalem. So you've got the Babylonians, you've got the Edomites, you've got the Egyptians, and in Matthew 24, you have the Jews. Matthew 24 is God's judgment against the Jews. And any Jew who heard the words of verses 29 to 31 would have known immediately what he was talking about, right? Because they've heard that before in Sunday school. When their Sunday school teacher taught them the book of Isaiah, they remembered that. They remembered it in chapter 13. They remembered it in 34. And when their Sunday school teacher, actually their Saturday school teacher, I see John back there, not the Sunday school teacher, their Saturday school teacher, and taught them about Ezekiel, they read about those same words being used against Egypt. And so these are not words or phrases that are unfamiliar to these people. Jesus is using Jewish terminology to convince Jews that Jerusalem is going to suffer the exact same fate as Babylon, Edom, and Egypt. And so the language itself is, for lack of a better term, common. Common. Now, while we think it's uncommon, to the Jews it was common. And in every instance where that type of language was used, it was judgment against a nation. And when you read about it in Matthew 24, it's judgment against a nation, the nation of Israel. And God utterly destroyed Israel and Jerusalem in AD 70. Now, I'm going to read to you something from Josephus, okay? Josephus was a Jewish historian, widely regarded as one of the great historians of his day, all right? Now, with regard to the events of Matthew 24, listen to what Josephus has to say. Josephus estimates that the Romans killed 1.1 million Jews in the siege and capture of Jerusalem. 1.1 million people slaughtered in that city. 97,000 taken captive and sold into slavery. This is from Josephus' War of the Jews. By the way, all of Josephus' works are available online. You can read them for free. All right? Of the horrors of the siege. Remember the siege. All the horror. Remember, there's a bunch of bad stuff that's going to take place before the city gets wrecked. Of the horrors of the siege, Josephus said, when the shadow of food anywhere did appear. The shadow of food. Listen to that language. When the shadow of food did anywhere appear, a war was commenced, and the dearest of friends fell, fighting one another about it, snatching from each other the most miserable supports of life. Can you imagine fighting your best friend to the death over a morsel of food, or what appeared to be food? Their hunger was so intolerable that it obliged them to chew everything, while they gathered such things as the most sordid of animals would not touch, and endured to eat them. Nor did they at length abstain from girdles, that is, a belt or shoes, and the very leather which belonged to their shields they pulled off and gnawed, and the very wisps of old hay became food for them. They were so hungry they chewed leather just to give themselves some semblance of taking some type of nourishment. Women even killed and consumed their own children. Of the carnage, Josephus says, the ground nowhere appeared visible for the dead bodies that lay on it. The soldiers went over the heaps of those bodies as they ran upon such as fled from them. And when they were come into the houses to plunder them, they found in them entire families of dead men, and the upper room full of dead corpses, that is, of such as died of famine. And they stood in horror at the sight, and went without touching anything. Yet they had not the same care for those who were still alive, but ran every one through whom they met, and obstructed the very roads with the dead bodies, and made the entire city run down with blood, so much to a degree that the fire of many houses was quenched with the blood of the victims. That is Josephus's rendering of the destruction of Jerusalem. We cannot even begin to imagine the horror. Even in our own day and time, we've not seen, really seen such. And so when we start reading about Matthew 24, and people want to say, well, this can't be the destruction of Jerusalem. Nothing could be that bad. Remember what Josephus wrote about it. And let that imagery enter into your mind. And think about how much blood does it take to put out a house fire. And Josephus said that the blood running through the streets quenched the fire from many of the houses. And so when Matthew 24 talks about the tribulation, it's talking about the destruction of Israel, the destruction of Jerusalem, and God's final judgment on Israel as a nation. Again, just like he did Babylon, just like he did Edom, just like he did Egypt. Okay? And there are other things that we could look at in the text. Time doesn't permit it. Matter of fact, if we don't get any additional questions, we may spend a little time talking more about the time frame, as well as the concept of left behind. But I think what we've talked about and looked at tonight is sufficient to show Matthew 24 has to be the destruction of Jerusalem, especially in particular the first 34 verses. All right, any questions or anything we need to mention about? All right, if not, I'm going to get this turned off.